What happens when one of cinema's most legendary directors faces off against late-night television's biggest provocateur? What you're about to witness is the most explosive celebrity interview meltdown in recent memory, a clash so intense that it left an entire studio audience speechless and had security rushing to intervene. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds here. The tension was palpable from the moment Martin Scorsese walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage. Unlike his usual composed demeanor during press appearances, there was something different about the acclaimed director tonight. His jaw was set, his movements deliberate, and those piercing eyes that had directed countless iconic scenes seemed to be sizing up his host before he even sat down. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his sharp wit and occasionally controversial interview style, appeared oblivious to the storm brewing across from him. "Martin, great to have you back on the show," Kimmel began with his trademark grin, but Scorsese's response was notably cold. "Jimmy?" he replied curtly, settling into his chair with the kind of calculated precision that made it clear this wasn't going to be another typical late-night chat about his latest project. The audience, still applauding, had no idea they were about to witness television history in the making. What had started as a routine promotional appearance for Scorsese's latest film quickly transformed into something far more sinister. Kimmel, perhaps sensing an opportunity for viral content, decided to push boundaries that should have remained untouched. His first question seemed innocent enough, asking about the director's creative process, but there was an underlying tone that suggested he had done his homework on more than just filmmaking techniques. "You know, Martin, I've been reading some interesting things about your early career," Kimmel said, leaning forward with that calculated casualness that late-night hosts perfect over years of practice. "Some people might say you've been quite selective about the stories you choose to tell on screen versus the stories you choose to keep private." The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Scorsese's expression shifted from professional courtesy to something far more dangerous. The director's hands, which had been resting casually on the arm of his chair, slowly clenched into fists. Anyone familiar with Scorsese's work would recognize this as the moment before the explosion, the calm before the cinematic storm that he had captured so brilliantly in films like Goodfellas and Casino. But this wasn't a movie. This was real life, and the tension in Studio 6B was becoming suffocating. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Jimmy," Scorsese replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades in an industry that had taught him to navigate treacherous waters. But Kimmel, either oblivious to the warning signs or deliberately ignoring them, pressed forward with the kind of reckless abandon that would make even the most seasoned television executives nervous. "Oh, come on, Martin. We're all friends here," Kimmel continued, his smile becoming more predatory by the second. "I'm talking about the stories behind the stories, the real inspiration for some of your more, shall we say, morally complex characters." The audience began to sense something was amiss, their laughter becoming more forced, more uncomfortable, as if they could feel the temperature in the room dropping despite the hot studio lights. Scorsese's response was measured, but loaded with threat. "My work speaks for itself, Jimmy. If you have something specific you'd like to discuss about my films, I'm happy to talk about the craft, the technique, the artistic choices. But if you're fishing for something else entirely, you might want to reconsider your approach." The words were delivered with the precision of a master filmmaker, each syllable weighted with meaning that extended far beyond their surface value. But Kimmel, in a moment that would define his career for all the wrong reasons, chose to double down. "I'm just saying, some of those characters feel awfully authentic. Almost like you've spent time with the kind of people most of us only see in movies." The implication was clear, and the silence that followed was deafening. Even the studio band seemed to sense that something had gone terribly wrong. Scorsese sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his eyes never leaving Kimmel's face. When he finally spoke, His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the kind of menace that had made his cinematic villains so unforgettable. Are you suggesting something about my personal associations, Jimmy? Because if you are, I think you should be very careful about where this conversation goes next. The warning should have been enough. Any reasonable person would have recognized the danger signals and steered the conversation back to safer territory. But Jimmy Kimmel, perhaps intoxicated by the potential for creating a viral moment, made the catastrophic decision to push even harder. Look, Martin, I'm not making accusations here. I'm just curious about your research methods. How does someone from the suburbs of New York end up knowing so much about organized crime that even the guys in your movies seem impressed by the authenticity? The question detonated like a bomb in the studio. Scorsese's entire demeanor transformed. In an instant, his professional mask slipping away to reveal something far more primal underneath. He leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a register that made everyone in the audience unconsciously hold their breath. You want to know about authenticity, Jimmy? You want to know about research? Let me tell you something about the difference between art and reality. What happened next would be replayed on social media thousands of times, analyzed frame by body language experts, and dissected by entertainment journalists for months to come. Scorsese's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles went white, and when he spoke again, every word was delivered with the precision of a man who had spent his entire career understanding the power of dramatic timing. I've dedicated my life to telling stories that matter, stories that reveal truths about human nature that most people are too comfortable to confront. But you, sitting behind that desk with your prepared questions and your smug little smile, you think you can reduce decades of artistic exploration to some kind of tabloid gossip? The director's voice was rising now, not in volume but in intensity, each word carrying more weight than the last. Kimmel, perhaps finally beginning to realize he had wandered into territory far more dangerous than he had anticipated, attempted to backtrack. Martin, I think there might be a misunderstanding here. I was just trying to give you an opportunity to talk about your creative process, maybe dispel some rumors that have been floating around. But his attempt at damage control only served to pour gasoline on an already raging fire. Rumors? Scorsese's laugh was devoid of any humor, a sound that seemed to echo from the darkest corners of his most twisted film scenes. You want to talk about rumors, Jimmy? Let's talk about the rumors surrounding your own behavior behind the scenes of this show. Let's discuss the stories I've heard about how you treat your staff, about the real Jimmy Kimmel when the cameras aren't rolling. The studio audience, which had been shifting uncomfortably in their seats, now sat in stunned silence. This had gone beyond awkward television into something genuinely frightening. Kimmel's face had gone pale, his usual confidence evaporating as he realized that he had picked a fight with someone who possessed far more ammunition than he had ever imagined. That's completely inappropriate, Martin, Kimmel stammered, but his protest sounded weak and desperate. We're here to talk about your film, not to engage in personal attacks. The irony of his statement was lost on no one, least of all Scorsese, who had been subjected to exactly the kind of personal attack he was now condemning. Inappropriate? Scorsese stood up from his chair, his movements fluid and controlled despite the obvious rage burning behind his eyes. You want to lecture me about what's appropriate. You invite me onto your show under the pretense of discussing my work, then spend your time fishing for scandal and innuendo, and now you want to talk about appropriateness? The director began pacing behind his chair, his hands gesturing with the same passionate intensity he brought to directing his most complex scenes. I've been making films for over 50 years, Jimmy. I've worked with actors, writers, producers, studio executives, critics, journalists, and in all that time, I've learned to recognize when someone is trying to exploit me for their own purposes. And that's exactly what you're doing right now. Kimmel, desperate to regain control of his own show, made one final, fatal mistake. Look, Martin, I understand you're upset, but this is live television. Maybe we should just take a breath and remember that we're both professionals here. The condescending tone of his voice, the implication that Scorsese was somehow behaving unprofessionally, was the final straw that would shatter whatever remained of the director's patience. The word professionals hung in the air like a challenge, and Martin Scorsese's reaction was immediate and devastating. His pacing stopped abruptly, and he turned to face Kimmel with an expression that could have frozen hell itself. Professionals? The word came out as barely more than a whisper, but it carried the force of a thunderclap. You want to talk about professionalism, Jimmy? What followed was a masterclass in controlled fury, delivered by a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of dramatic confrontation. Scorsese walked slowly back toward his chair, but instead of sitting down, he placed both hands on the back of it and leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Kimmel's increasingly panicked face. Professionalism is showing up prepared, knowing your subject matter, treating your guests with respect, and conducting yourself with dignity. Professionalism is not ambushing someone with thinly veiled accusations disguised as questions. Professionalism is not trying to destroy someone's reputation for the sake of your ratings. Each word was delivered with surgical precision, and the studio audience could feel the weight of every syllable. Kimmel, his face now visibly sweating under the studio lights, made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Martin, I think you're overreacting here. This is just a conversation between two people in the entertainment industry. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot, but there's no need to make this into something it's not. His voice was shaking now, the confident late-night host persona crumbling in real time. But Scorsese was far from finished. Overreacting? His voice rose for the first time since the confrontation began, and the sound sent a visible shiver through the studio audience. You spend the first 10 minutes of this interview fishing for dirt about my personal life, making implications about my character and my associations, trying to turn my life's work into fodder for your monologue. And you think I'm overreacting? The director straightened up to his full height, and despite being physically smaller than his host, he seemed to tower over everything in the studio. Let me tell you something about the entertainment industry, Jimmy. I've been in it long enough to know the difference between legitimate journalism and cheap exploitation. I've seen careers destroyed by people like you, people who think that because they have a platform, they have the right to say whatever they want about whoever they want. Kimmel tried once more to interrupt, raising his hands in what was meant to be a placating gesture. Martin, please, let's just... But Scorsese cut him off with a look that could have stopped traffic. No, Jimmy. You wanted this conversation. Now you're going to hear it through to the end. The director's voice had taken on the cadence of his most memorable film monologues, each word carefully chosen and delivered with maximum impact. You see, the problem with people like you is that you've never had to create anything meaningful. You've never put your heart and soul into something only to have it picked apart by vultures looking for scandal. The studio had become so quiet that the hum of the cameras was audible. Even the production crew, usually bustling with activity, had stopped what they were doing to watch this unprecedented meltdown unfold. Scorsese continued his verbal assault with the relentless intensity of a master storyteller building to his climax. You want to know about my characters, Jimmy? You want to know where they come from? They come from observation, from understanding, from spending time with people from all walks of life and trying to capture their humanity on screen. But more than that, they come from recognizing that every person has the capacity for both good and evil, for both nobility and corruption. Scorsese began walking toward Kimmel's desk, his movements deliberate and threatening. And right now, looking at you, seeing how you've conducted yourself tonight, I'm getting a pretty clear picture of which side of that equation you fall on. The words were delivered with such venom that several audience members actually gasped, audibly. Kimmel, now clearly in full panic mode, looked toward his producers off stage, his eyes pleading for some kind of intervention. But this was live television, and there was nowhere to hide. "Martin, I think maybe we should wrap this up. Maybe take a commercial break and—" "Oh no, Jimmy," Scorsese interrupted, his voice carrying a tone of dark amusement. "You wanted to put on a show. Now you're going to finish it. You wanted to embarrass me on national television, to try to damage my reputation for your own entertainment. Well, congratulations. You've certainly created something memorable." The director had reached Kimmel's desk now, and he placed both hands on its surface, leaning forward until he was mere inches from the host's face. "But here's the thing about trying to tear down someone who has nothing to hide, Jimmy. Sometimes you end up revealing more about yourself than about your target. And what you've revealed tonight is that you're exactly the kind of person I've spent my career exposing in my films, a small, petty, vindictive individual who gets his thrills from trying to destroy others." Kimmel's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. The confident, quick-witted host who had built his career on his ability to handle any situation had been completely and utterly destroyed by the force of Scorsese's righteous anger. "You know what the really pathetic part is, Jimmy?" Scorsese continued, his voice now carrying a note of genuine pity. "You could have had a real conversation tonight. You could have asked about the craft, about the art, about the decades of experience I've accumulated. You could have given your audience something valuable, something meaningful. Instead, you chose to wallow in the gutter, and that says everything anyone needs to know about who you really are." The director straightened up and looked out at the stunned studio audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you had to witness this. You came here expecting entertainment, and instead you got to see what happens when journalism dies and is replaced by exploitation." He turned back to Kimmel one final time, his expression now more disappointed than angry. "I've wasted enough of my time here, Jimmy. I've got real work to do, real stories to tell, real art to create. You can stay here and continue to contribute nothing meaningful to the world." With that, Martin Scorsese turned and walked toward the exit, his steps echoing in the deathly silent studio. But he wasn't quite finished. Just as he reached the edge of the stage, he turned back one final time, and what he said next would become the most quoted moment of the entire confrontation. "You know, Jimmy, in all my years of making movies about corrupt, morally bankrupt characters, I never thought I'd meet someone who made them look sympathetic by comparison. Congratulations on that achievement." And with that final devastating blow, Martin Scorsese walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live stage, leaving behind a host who looked like he'd been hit by a freight train, a studio audience in complete shock, and a moment of television that would be talked about for years to come. The camera lingered on Kimmel's face for several excruciating seconds before finally cutting to commercial, but the damage had been done. The master filmmaker had delivered his most powerful performance yet, and it wasn't even in a movie. So what do you think drove Kimmel to push Scorsese so far over the edge? Was this a calculated move for ratings, or just poor judgment? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more incredible behind-the-scenes stories from Hollywood.